She did not come to Seoul to fall in love. She came to disappear. The night Adaeze Okonkwo landed at Incheon International Airport, she had exactly one suitcase, one carry-on bag stuffed with her mother's dried uziza leaves because she refused to believe Korea would have anything comparable, and one secret she had told no one. Not her mother, not her best friend Chisom, not the scholarship committee that had funded her flight, her tuition, and 12 months of housing in a city she had only ever seen on a screen. The secret was this: she was not here for the fellowship. She was here because 6 months ago, in a hospital room in Enugu that smelled of antiseptic and the particular sadness of fluorescent lighting, a doctor had said the word remission, and Adaeze had sat with that word for 3 weeks before she understood what she needed to do with it. She needed to live somewhere no one knew her before the illness, somewhere she could be a woman, not a patient, somewhere the first thing people saw when they looked at her was not the shadow of what she had survived. Seoul was far enough. If you are already feeling something, good. That means we are doing this right. Before we go any further, do me one favor. Hit like and subscribe. This is a 2-part story, and you will not forgive yourself for missing what comes in part 2. I promise you that. Now, let's go back to Incheon, the arrivals hall, Adaeze and her uziza leaves. She was 28 years old. She had a doctorate in environmental policy that she had completed while receiving chemotherapy because she was, in the words of her supervisor at the University of Nigeria, constitutionally incapable of stillness. She had full locks that fell past her shoulders, a laugh that arrived before she decided to use it, and the specific kind of beauty that takes a room a few seconds to process, not because it is subtle, but because it is complete. The kind of face that looks like it has already survived something and decided the surviving was worth it. She rolled her suitcase through the arrivals hall and stood at the exit and looked at Seoul for the first time through a set of automatic glass doors. The city looked back at her, indifferent and luminous as cities always do when you arrive somewhere alone. Okay, she thought. Okay. She took a breath of air that smelled like a country that did not know her name. That was, she realized, exactly what she needed. His name was Kwon Seokhyun. Most people in his professional life called him Chairman Quan. His executive team called him Hwaejong-nim and stood slightly straighter when they said it. The financial press called him the most strategically precise mind in Korean sustainable infrastructure, which is the sort of sentence that sounds like a compliment until you spend 5 minutes in a room with him and understand that precision, in Kwon Seokhyun's case, was not a professional trait, it was armor. He was 43 years old. He ran KSH Group, a conglomerate with fingers in green energy, urban development, and water infrastructure across 12 countries, including, as of 8 months ago, a joint venture with the Nigerian federal government for a solar-powered water treatment initiative in the Niger Delta. He had the lean, controlled stillness of a man who had long ago learned that stillness was power, and the eyes of someone who was always reading the room before the room had finished composing itself. He was also, though none of his board members knew this, insomniac. Not the performative kind, not the "I only sleep 4 hours because I am exceptional" narrative that Korean business culture occasionally gloried in. Genuinely biochemically incapable of sleeping past 3 a.m., a condition that had worsened in the past 2 years for reasons he did not discuss with anyone, including his therapist, whom he paid generously and told almost nothing. He was, in the clinical language, highly functional. In the honest language, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with a Tuesday morning 2 years ago, when his younger brother had walked out of a boardroom, gotten into a car, and simply not come back. Accident, people said. Terrible accident. He did not correct them. He corrected nothing anymore that people said about things they had not been present for. They met on a Wednesday. Not at a gala, not in a boardroom, not in the cinematic setting that their story would later seem to demand in retrospect. They met because of rain and a map app and the specific cruelty of Seoul's late October weather, which arrives without announcement and leaves you wet before you finish deciding whether you needed an umbrella. Adaeze was lost. She had been in Seoul for exactly 11 days. She spoke conversational Korean. She had studied it for a year before arriving, motivated by stubbornness and a collection of subtitled films she'd watched during her longer hospital stays. But conversational Korean and navigational Korean, she had discovered, were entirely different languages. The map had stopped responding. The rain had started with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting all month for permission, and the street she was standing on in Songdong-gu, outside a row of low buildings with handwritten signs she could not parse, was apparently not the street the map believed it to be. She had an appointment, a briefing with the KSH Group Environmental Liaison Team about the Niger Delta joint venture. She was, technically, an academic consultant on the project, the Nigerian scholar whose published research on community-level water access had been cited 17 times in the project's environmental impact assessment. She was 20 minutes away from being late to her first professional meeting of her new Seoul life. She was standing in the rain without an umbrella, squinting at a phone with a cracked screen, wearing a yellow raincoat that was doing approximately 40% of the job a raincoat should do, when a black car slowed at the curb beside her, and the window came down. She didn't look up immediately. She had learned as a woman who had lived in Lagos not to immediately engage with cars that slowed near her on streets. The address on this block runs east to west, not north to south. Most maps get it wrong, said a voice. Low, measured, Korean-accented English, deliberate as a sentence in a contract. Most maps get it wrong. She looked up. Kwon Seokhyun was not looking at her the way men usually looked at her when they stopped cars on streets. He was looking at the building over her shoulder with the expression of someone pointing out an error in a document. Clinical. Efficient. Then his eyes came to her face, briefly, evaluatively, and something happened in them that was not clinical at all, though it lasted only a moment before the professional surface closed over it like water over a stone. "You have a briefing at KSH at 2, he said. Not a question. You're Dr. Okonkwo. She stared at him. "I read the consultant brief this morning," he answered, the question she hadn't asked yet. "Get in. I'll take you around the block." She looked at the rain, she looked at the car, she looked at the man who was already returning his attention to the documents in his lap with the air of someone who had solved a logistical problem and was now moving to the next item. "I can walk," she said. "It's 400 meters and raining at approximately 12 millimeters per hour. By the time you arrive, you will be—" She looked at her yellow coat. He paused. "Wetter." Adaeze looked down at the coat, looked at the sky, which showed absolutely no interest in becoming less of itself. She opened the car door and got in. The door closed, the car moved. Neither of them spoke for approximately 30 seconds, which felt, in the small, contained space of a luxury vehicle in the rain, significantly longer than 30 seconds. "Thank you," she said. "The access entrance is on the south side," he said. "The main entrance lobby has a 12-minute security queue on Wednesdays because of the delivery schedule. Use the south entrance and tell them Director Shin sent you. You'll be through in 2. She looked at him. He did not look at her. He turned a page of his documents. "You're not Director Shin," she said. "No," he said. "Who were you?" The car stopped. They had arrived. His door was already opening. A driver she hadn't noticed was holding it from outside. He stepped out into the rain without getting wet, which she would later identify as one of her more irritating qualities. He looked back at her through the open door. In the gray October light, with the rain falling behind him and the city moving past, and his face doing exactly nothing except watching her with those reading eyes, he said, "I'm the reason the project exists. Welcome to Seoul, Dr. Okonkwo." He walked into the building. Adaeze sat in the car for exactly 3 seconds. Then she got out, pulled her yellow coat around her, and followed him through the south entrance, thinking 2 things simultaneously. The first was, "I need a better map app." The second was a thought she immediately filed away as irrelevant, inadvisable, and almost certainly going to cause problems. The thought was, "I am in serious trouble." The south entrance of KSH Group's headquarters was everything the rain outside was not. Quiet, controlled. The kind of interior that did not happen by accident. Black granite floors polished to a depth that made you feel you were walking slightly above yourself. Walls paneled in pale ash wood. The air temperature calibrated to exactly the degree that made you forget you had been cold 30 seconds ago. Everything in the building communicated the same thing, in the same tone, without raising its voice. Power lives here, and it has nothing to prove. Adaeze noticed all of it. She noticed everything, always. It was the thing her illness had sharpened in her, this acute attentiveness, as though her body had decided that if it was going to spend months in a reduced state, it would compensate by making her mind ravenous. She noticed the receptionist's posture, perfectly composed, the particular neutrality of someone trained to be welcoming without being warm. She noticed the small arrangement of white chrysanthemums on the corner of the desk, fresh, replaced today. She noticed that Kwon Seokhyun, walking 3 paces ahead of her, had not looked back once since entering the building. She also noticed, and this she filed immediately under irrelevant, that he moved through the space the way a sentence moves through a paragraph, like he had been written there, like the room had been arranged with him in mind. The receptionist looked up, looked at Adaeze, looked at the man ahead of her, straightened incrementally. "Huijangnim," she said. "Chairman," Adaeze translated internally. Her Korean, she realized, had just answered its own question. The briefing room was on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced east, and in the gray October afternoon, Seoul stretched out below them like something that had been assembling itself for decades and was not finished yet. Han River a silver thread through the middle of it, apartment towers rising in clusters on both banks. The particular organized density of a city that had rebuilt itself from rubble within living memory and decided, in doing so, to build upward. Adaeze stood at the window for exactly the amount of time it took her to decide she was allowed to be moved by it. Then she turned around and sat down. There were 4 people already seated at the table. Director Shin, who was, it turned out, a compact woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and the efficient warmth of someone who had been managing people longer than some of the junior staff had been alive. 2 environmental engineers whose names Adaeze caught and held, Park Jun-ho and Lee De-som, and a man she didn't recognize who said nothing and took notes in a system she couldn't decipher. Kwon Seokhyun sat at the head of the table. He had not been scheduled to attend this briefing. She could tell from the way Director Shin's expression shifted, fractionally, professionally, the way experienced people absorb unexpected developments, when he walked in and took the chair. He opened his copy of the project brief. He uncapped a pen. He said nothing. He was simply suddenly a presence at the head of a room that had reorganized itself around him without anyone explicitly deciding to do so. Adaeze watched this happen. She found it interesting. She also found it, she told herself firmly, entirely professionally interesting and nothing else whatsoever. The briefing began. It was her presentation. She had prepared it over 3 days in her small apartment in Mapo-gu, cross-referencing her doctoral research with the project's existing environmental assessments, building the argument for why community consultation needed to precede infrastructure installation in the specific Delta communities KSH had earmarked for Phase 1. She presented in English, which was the working language of the international collaboration. She was good at this. Not the performance of confidence, which she had never needed to perform, but the actual thing. She spoke about water and communities like people speak about things they have spent years thinking about in the dark, precisely, and with a kind of controlled urgency that made people lean forward without quite knowing they were doing it. "The Oza community in River State," she said, advancing to the slide she had spent the most time on, a photograph she had taken herself 3 years before the diagnosis, on a field visit that now felt like it had happened to someone slightly different from the woman standing here. "Has been promised water infrastructure 4 times in 20 years, 4 different government initiatives, 4 groundbreaking ceremonies. They have photographs of every one. The village head keeps them in a plastic folder. He showed them to me." She paused. Let the room hold that for a moment. "What KSH is proposing is technically excellent. The solar-powered treatment system is among the most efficient I have reviewed. But technical excellence installed without community ownership becomes community-adjacent infrastructure. It sits beside people's lives instead of inside them. And when it breaks, when anything breaks, which it will, because everything does, there is no local knowledge base to fix it, no investment in its survival, and the community returns to where it was. Except now there's also a rusting structure in the middle of their village that means something failed. Again." Silence. Director Shin was nodding slowly, the considered nod of someone cross-referencing what they're hearing against what they already know. Adaeze looked at her slides. She looked at Director Shin. She looked briefly, and entirely against her better judgment, at the man at the head of the table. Kwon Seokhyun was not looking at her slides. He had not looked at his copy of her brief in 11 minutes. He was looking at her face with the full and undivided attention of someone who had stopped performing the act of listening and was simply, actually doing it. He held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he looked back at her slides. "My recommendation," she continued, her voice unchanged, "is a 4-month community integration phase before any installation begins. I have a framework. I'm happy to walk through it." The briefing ran 40 minutes over schedule, not because of inefficiency, because Kwon Seokhyun asked questions. Careful, specific, structurally precise questions that told her she had read not just the project brief, but her published research, which was something she had not expected, and which she found, against all her intentions, deeply disarming. He asked about the plastic folder, the village head and his 4 photographs of 4 failed promises. "What would it take," he said, leaning slightly forward, pen held loosely between 2 fingers, "for the 5th one to be different? Not structurally, not on paper. In the room with the man and his plastic folder. What would it actually take?" The room was quiet. Adaeze looked at him. "Someone would have to go," she said, "in person, not a project manager with a clipboard, someone with the weight to make the promise mean something, someone who can sit with him, look at his 4 photographs, and say, 'I understand why you do not believe this yet,' and then do the work to earn the belief." A pause. "That's not usually how it's done," Director Shin said gently, not disagreeing, mapping the gap between the ideal and the operational. "No," Adaeze said, "it isn't." She was looking at Shin when she said it, but she was aware, with the peripheral accuracy of a woman who had learned to monitor many things at once, that Kwon Seokhyun had written something in the margin of his document. She could not read it from across the table. She did not try. The meeting ended at 4:30. The rain had stopped. Seoul out the window had shifted into its late afternoon mode, the sky doing that particular thing it did in October, going gold and gray simultaneously, as if it couldn't decide between them, and had settled on both. People filed out. Director Shen paused at the door to tell Adaeze that her framework was very thorough, in the tone of someone who meant it. The engineers exchanged cards with her. The silent note-taker left without making eye contact with anyone. Adaeze was putting her laptop into her bag when she became aware that she was no longer in the room. She did not startle. She had very good peripheral awareness. She looked up. Kwon Seokhyun was standing at the window, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the forearm, the first slightly informal thing she had seen from him. He was looking at the city. His hands were in his trouser pockets. His back was to her, but the window's reflection gave him his face, and his face, unguarded for perhaps the first time since she met him 4 hours ago, looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the afternoon. She should have said goodbye and left. She did not say goodbye and leave. "The Han River," she said instead. She was not sure why. Every time I look at it, I expect it to be smaller. It keeps being large. A moment. Then from the window, "You've been here 11 days. 12 now. What did you expect Seoul to be?" She thought about this honestly. "Louder," she said. "I expected it to feel more like Lagos. The scale is similar, but Lagos is loud in a way that means, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Seoul is loud in a different way. It's more like, I have already been here, I don't need to announce it." He turned from the window. He looked at her across the briefing table, the long, empty table with the 4 o'clock light crossing it, and both of them standing at opposite ends of it like two people on opposite banks of something. "You described my city better in 12 days than most people I know have in a lifetime," he said quietly. "I pay attention," she said. "I know," he said. "I noticed." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them has named yet, both aware of the edge, neither moving toward it. It lasted 4 seconds. Then his phone rang, the third time in the past hour, the first 2 having been declined with a single button press, and this time his face changed when he looked at the screen. Not the boardroom control, something older. Underneath it, something with the texture of obligation and grief running together, which Adaeze, who knew both of those textures personally, recognized immediately. He answered in Korean. His voice shifted, lower, careful. He turned slightly away. Adaeze picked up her bag. She moved to the door. She was practiced in the art of giving people their privacy. Hospitals had taught her that, among other things. She was in the doorway when he spoke again, not into the phone. The call was still connected, held away from his ear. "Dr. Okonkwo." She turned. He was looking at her across the empty room with the window behind him and Seoul going gold outside, and his face doing the guarded thing again, the armor back in place, but not quite all the way. Not the way it had been when she first got in his car in the rain. "The community integration framework," he said. "I'd like to review it, properly, not in a briefing." She waited. "Are you available Thursday?" She looked at him for one moment, at the tiredness behind the precision, at the window, at the river, endlessly large and endlessly patient below. "I'll check my schedule," she said. She left. In the elevator going down, alone, she pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about the plastic folder with 4 photographs of 4 broken promises, and the man at the window who had asked the only question that mattered, and the fact that she had come to Seoul to disappear and was standing in an elevator feeling, for the first time in 6 months, entirely, dangerously visible. Trouble, she thought again. The elevator opened. She walked out into the lobby. She walked past the white chrysanthemums and the polished floors. Outside, Seoul was waiting, gold and gray and enormous. She walked into it. Thursday came the way significant days often do, quietly, without announcing itself, wearing the ordinary clothes of an ordinary morning. Adaeze woke at 6, not because she had to, because her body, even 2 years past the worst of it, still operated on the schedule of someone who had learned not to waste the hours that felt good. She lay in the narrow bed of her Mapogu apartment and listened to Seoul assembling itself outside her window, the first delivery trucks, the creak of a shutter being raised at the convenience store below, the particular silence that exists between 6 a.m. and 6:15 a.m. in a city of 10 million people, that brief held breath before the day begins in full. She thought about Thursday. She thought about a man at a window, sleeves rolled, looking at a city like it owed him something. She got up. She made tea, Not the green tea she had developed an appreciation for in her first week, but her mother's black tea, Lipton in a mug, steeped longer than was probably advisable, with condensed milk that she had found to her genuine relief in a Nigerian grocery in Itaewon that she had visited twice already and felt, both times, the complicated warmth of finding a version of home inside another country. She wrapped her hands around the mug. She stood at her window. Her apartment was small, scholarship housing, functional and clean, with a single window that faced west and caught the afternoon light better than the morning. From here, she could see 3 rooftops, a section of elevated highway, and, if she stood at the right angle and craned slightly, a strip of the Han River, silver and distant. She thought about the village head in his plastic folder. She thought about the word remission and what it meant to build a life in the space it left behind. She got dressed. She picked up her laptop bag. She left. He had sent an address. Not the KSH headquarters, a different location entirely, a neighborhood in Songbukgu that her map app, chastened by the Wednesday incident, handled correctly this time. The streets here were narrower, older. The architecture had not been replaced, but accumulated. Small traditional houses pressed between newer buildings, trees that had been growing longer than most of the surrounding structures. It had the feeling of a place that had been allowed to remember itself. The address resolved to a small building set back slightly from the street behind a low wall. A wooden sign beside the gate had characters she could read: Changwon, Garden, and below it, in smaller text, a name she didn't recognize. She pushed the gate open. It was a restaurant, or it had been once. The interior, visible through a screen door, had the bones of a traditional Korean dining space: low tables, ondel flooring, paper screens diffusing the morning light into something soft and indirect. But the front room, where she was shown by a small elderly woman who appeared from nowhere and bowed and gestured without speaking, had been arranged differently. A single table, Western height, set for 2. A window looking into a courtyard where a persimmon tree was doing the October thing, going the specific deep orange that Seoul's autumn produced, as if the season had decided to be emphatic about itself. Kwon Seokhyun was already there. He was standing at the courtyard window, not sitting. He had his phone in his hand, but he was not looking at it. He was looking at the persimmon tree with the expression she had caught in the boardroom window's reflection on Wednesday, the unguarded one, the tired one. He heard her come in. The expression closed. Not unkindly, it was not the face of a man who did not want to see her. It was the face of a man who had forgotten for a moment that he was expected to be composed and had remembered just in time. "Dr. Okonkwo?" he said. "Adaeze," she said. "If we are going to look at documents together, Dr. Okonkwo takes too long." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the nearest he had come to one. "Kwon Seokhyun," he said, "if you prefer." "I'll use it when it fits," she said. She sat down, she opened her laptop, she spread her framework documents on the table in the organized way she had learned to work, a system her treatment nurses had teased her about, the color-coded folders and the margin notes in 3 different pen colors. Chisom called it her being alive paperwork. She had never told her friend how accurate that was. He sat across from her. He looked at her documents with the attention she had already identified as his characteristic mode, not performative thoroughness, but genuine, almost forensic engagement. He read before he spoke. He asked before he concluded. She had been in enough meetings with enough powerful men to know how rare this was. The elderly woman appeared again and placed 2 cups of tea on the table. Songwatang, the dark herbal Korean tea that smelled of cinnamon and something deeper, older. Adaeze looked at it. "I ordered it in advance," he said, without looking up at her document. "You mentioned in your faculty profile that you research traditional community health practices. I thought you might find it interesting. It's been made by the same family for 3 generations." She looked at the tea. She looked at him. He was reading her framework with a pen in his hand, making the small, precise notations of someone fully absorbed. He had looked up the tea, he had ordered it in advance, he had read her faculty profile closely enough to retain a detail about her research interests. She thought, he pays attention, too. She thought, that is considerably more dangerous than I anticipated. She picked up the tea. It was warm and complex and tasted faintly of something she could not name, but felt like it was made by people who understood that healing and flavor were not separate categories. It's extraordinary, she said. He looked up. Yes, he said, simply, still watching her. She looked at her laptop. The framework? The framework, he agreed. They worked for 2 hours. It was the kind of working session she had not had in a long time, not the performance of collaboration, but the real thing. 2 people building something between them in real time, each bringing what the other didn't have. She had the community knowledge, the field research, the understanding of what trust looked like in the specific human context of a village that had been let down by institutions 4 times. He had the structural thinking, the operational precision, the ability to look at her 4-month integration timeline and ask what breaks at month 2 in a way that made her immediately see the weakness she had been too close to notice. He challenged her twice, not dismissively, surgically. She pushed back both times. He listened to the pushback with the full attention, reconsidered, and on the second one said, "You're right, the sequencing was wrong. Show me your alternative." She showed him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "This is better." She had been agreed with by many people in many rooms. She could not explain why his agreement felt different, except that it didn't feel like agreement, it felt like recognition, like a peer marking a conclusion correctly, not a superior granting approval. She was, she realized, enjoying herself. She was also, she realized, watching his hands, the way he held the pen, the way he turned pages with the care of someone who handled important documents long enough to respect paper. His hands were not what she had expected from the image she had assembled of him, not soft, not purely executive. There was something in the knuckles, some trace of physical labor long past, that did not match the 14-floor corner office. She did not ask about it, not yet. At 11 o'clock, the elderly woman brought food. Adaeze had not been told food was coming. She looked at the table, japchae in a deep bowl, translucent noodles tangled with vegetables and the dark gloss of soy and sesame, a small dish of kimchi that smelt like it had been fermenting since before either of them was born, and hobakjeon, the zucchini pancake she had tried on her second day in Seoul and had been thinking about since. She looked at the spread. She looked at him. "I didn't know we were having lunch," she said. "It's 11. Technically, it's a late breakfast." "This is not a late breakfast. This is a meal that was prepared in advance. The kitchen here prepares it daily. I simply asked to set 2 places." She sat back slightly. She looked at him with the direct reading look she had been deploying since she was a child, the one her mother called Adaze's audit. He met it without shifting. "Why?" she said. A pause. The first time she had seen him pause before answering something. "You spent the first 40 minutes of Wednesday's briefing without eating or drinking anything, including the water on the table, and you left before the refreshments were brought up after the meeting." She stared at him. "I was not surveilling you," he said, with the careful tone of a man who understands how that sentence sounds and wants to position it correctly. "You noticed I didn't eat. I noticed you were focused, a beat, and I noticed you were thin in the way that means something other than natural." The room went very still. Not the comfortable still of their composed silence, a different kind, the kind that arrives when something true has been said in a direction no one fully expected. Adaeze looked at the japchae. She looked at the persimmon tree outside. She looked at her hands on the table. She had a choice here. She had made this choice before, many times, in many rooms, the choice between deflection and disclosure, between the version of herself that could be explained in 1 sentence and the version that took longer and cost more to share. She looked at him. He was watching her, not the pity one she would have closed immediately against pity, with the careful, respectful attention of someone who has made an observation and is prepared to accept whatever response it receives, including none. "I was ill," she said. "I am well now. I eat. I'm just rearranging my relationship with food, with all of it. Appetite takes a while to come back, not just for food." She hadn't planned to say that last part. It arrived of its own accord, the truth wearing casual clothes. He nodded. He did not say, "I'm sorry," or "that must have been hard," or any of the things people said, helpfully and uselessly. He said, "Take whatever you want. Leave the rest." He picked up his chopsticks. He began to eat, quietly, without ceremony, giving her back the privacy of an ordinary meal. She looked at the japchae. She picked up her own chopsticks. The noodles were extraordinary, sweet and savory and yielding, with the sesame oil finishing like a warm exhale. She ate more than she expected to. She looked up at one point and found him watching her. Not the analytical watch, not the boardroom watch. Something softer, gone quickly when their eyes met. "It's very good," she said. "She has been making it the same way for 30 years, he said. "Her daughter will make it the same way for 30 more. That kind of continuity is—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at the tree, the persimmon, heavy and orange in the October light. "My mother has a soup, othe onugbu, bitter leaf soup. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers. 3 generations at least, maybe more, but we lost the counting somewhere." She paused. "I haven't had it since I left. I brought the leaves, I just haven't been ready to make it yet." He was very still. "Why not?" he asked, quiet, not prying, genuinely asking. She considered this. The honest answer was, "Because making it means I'm home, and if I'm home, then the version of me that survived is real and permanent, and I'm not sure I've finished being afraid that it isn't." But that answer lived several layers below the surface, and she had only known this man for 2 days. "The kitchen in my apartment is very small," she said instead. "There isn't really room." He looked at her. She had the feeling, acute and slightly unnerving, that he had heard both answers. They returned to the framework after lunch, but something had shifted, not in the work, which remained precise and purposeful, but in the atmosphere between them. The professional distance that had organized the morning had recalibrated slightly. Not collapsed, they were both too careful for that, both too accustomed to maintaining the careful architecture of appropriate boundaries, but recalibrated. The table felt shorter, the silences between points felt less formal. At 2 in the afternoon, he took a call. He stepped to the far side of the room, his back to her, and spoke in rapid Korean that she followed in parts, something about a flight, a schedule, a name she didn't catch. His posture during the call was different from any posture she had seen from him, tighter, something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of obligation carried at a specific and personal cost. He came back to the table. He sat. He looked at the documents without seeing them for 3 seconds. She counted, she always counted, and then his focus returned. "I have to travel next week, Osaka, 3 days. The project doesn't require your personal involvement at this stage. Director Shin and I can manage the Phase 1 consultation design." "I know." He paused. "I wasn't mentioning it in relation to the project." The room went quiet. She looked at him carefully. "Then why were you mentioning it?" He looked at his pen. He looked at the persimmon tree. He looked at her. He said, "I thought you should know that I will be back by Friday." 4 seconds of silence. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They went back to the documents. Neither of them addressed what had just happened, the small, precise, unmistakable thing that had just been said under the cover of logistics. But it had been said. It lived in the room with them for the rest of the afternoon, warm and unacknowledged, like the Songwha Tong. She left at 4. He walked her to the gate, not to the street, just to the gate, which felt like a considered choice, a deliberate stopping point. The persimmon tree was visible over the low wall. The street beyond was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull. She turned at the gate. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, and the low autumn sun was behind him, and his face had the open tiredness again, the unguarded version, the one that lived underneath the chairman. "The framework is good, better than good," he said. "I know," she said. Not arrogance, just truth. The corner of his mouth moved again, closer to a smile this time. "Thursday next week, when I'm back from Osaka." She nodded. She pushed the gate open. She walked 3 steps. "Adaeze?" She turned. He was still at the gate. He had the look of a man who has decided to say something before he talks himself out of it. "The kitchen here," he said, "the one that makes the japchae. It has space and good equipment." A pause. "If you ever wanted to make the soup." She stood on the pavement in the October afternoon and looked at him, this precise, armored, expectantly attentive man who had noticed she hadn't eaten and ordered food in advance and read her faculty profile and was now offering her a kitchen, which was either the most practical or the most tender thing anyone had said to her in 2 years, and was somehow in his mouth entirely both. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll think about it." She walked away. She did not look back. She had learned in the past 2 years that some things were better processed in motion. She was halfway down the street when her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She stopped walking. She opened the message. "The kitchen is free on weekend mornings. KSH." She stared at the message. She looked up at the street. She looked back at the message. She typed, "How do you have my number?" The response came in under a minute. "Director Shin's assistant. I asked on Wednesday." She stood on the pavement in Songbuk-gu and thought about that. About Wednesday, about a man who asked for her number on Wednesday and waited until Thursday to use it, and used it to offer her a kitchen, which was either the most practical or the most tender thing anyone had said to her in 2 years, and was somehow in his mouth entirely both. She typed, "That is a significant amount of planning for a casual offer." His response, "I don't make casual offers." She put the phone in her pocket. She started walking again. The Han River was somewhere to the south, invisible from here, but present in the way it always was, large and patient and not going anywhere. She thought, "I came here to disappear." She thought, "I am becoming more visible by the day." She thought about the soup her mother made, the bitter leaves, the 3 generations of women who had stood over the same pot and understood that some recipes are not about food at all. She thought, maybe Friday. She walked home through Seoul in the October light, and the city moved around her, loud and quiet simultaneously, enormous and specific, full of people living their lives at full volume. And for the first time since she had landed at Incheon with 1 suitcase and 1 secret and a body that was learning to trust itself again, Adaeze Okonkwo felt something she had been carefully not looking for. She felt like she might be, improbably and dangerously and completely against the plan, exactly where she was supposed to be. The weekend came and she did not go to the kitchen, not because she had changed her mind, because she spent Saturday standing in front of her small apartment stove, holding the dried uziza leaves her mother had packed, folded carefully in newspaper, the way her mother wrapped everything precious, as though the wrapping itself was part of the preservation, and understanding that she was not ready, not yet. The leaves smelled like unuku, like the back of her mother's kitchen on a Sunday, like the specific quality of light that came through the window above the sink at home, which was nothing like Seoul light, which was a different argument entirely. She put the leaves back in the bag. She closed the bag. She made Lipton in a mug and stood at her window and watched the Han River strip in the distance and thought about a text she had not replied to since Thursday. "The kitchen is free on weekend mornings." She had not replied beyond the exchange about Director Shin's assistant. She had left it there, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew too well. And what she knew was this: if I go to that kitchen, something changes. And she was still deciding whether she was ready for the change. Her phone rang. Chisum. She answered immediately, the way you answer calls from the person who sat with you through your worst nights and never once made you feel like a burden. Adaeze, Chisum's voice, warm and Lagos direct and containing, as always, more information in 2 syllables than most people conveyed in a paragraph. You have the voice. What voice? The voice you have when something is happening that you haven't told me about yet. Adaeze looked at the Han River Strip. I'm in Seoul, Chisum. Things are constantly happening. Adaeze Okonkwo. A pause. There is a man, Adaeze said. The sound Chisum made was not words. It was a full emotional response compressed into a single syllable that communicated simultaneously, finally, tell me everything, I knew it, be careful, and also tell me everything. It's not tell me. So she told her. The rain and the car and the south entrance and the briefing and the window and Thursday and the japchae and the persimmon tree and the kitchen offer and the text. She told it carefully, the way she told things that mattered, not leaving anything out but not performing anything either. When she finished, Chisum was quiet for a moment. He ordered the tea in advance, Chisum said finally. Yes. He noticed you didn't eat. Yes. He offered you a kitchen to make your mother's soup. Yes. Adaeze. I know. That man is in trouble. I think we both might be. She went on Sunday. She told herself it was about the soup. She believed this approximately 40%. She carried the uziza leaves in her bag and took the subway to Sengbakgu and walked the now familiar street and pushed open the gate. The courtyard was quiet. The persimmon tree had lost 2 more fruits overnight. They lay orange on the ground, like something the tree had decided to release. The elderly woman was in the kitchen already, moving around it with the efficiency of someone who has owned a space so long that she and the room had become a single system. She looked up when Adaeze came in. She said something in Korean that Adaeze caught the shape of, but not the full meaning, something welcoming, something that included a word for daughter that elderly Korean women used for young women they had decided to be kind to, and which landed somewhere soft in Adaeze's chest. I was told the kitchen might be available, Adaeze said in Korean. The elderly woman nodded. She pointed to a section of the prep counter, clear, spacious, properly equipped. She mimed, "It's yours." Then she went back to her own work, which appeared to involve a quantity of Korean radish and a level of personal investment that suggested the radish had no idea what was coming. Adaeze set down her bag. She unwrapped the uziza leaves. She stood at the counter for a moment, just holding them. They were dry, but intact. Her mother had wrapped them well, had known she would need them eventually, even if she didn't know it yet herself. Mothers always pack for the version of you that hasn't arrived yet, she thought. They see farther down the road than you do. She began. She was 40 minutes into it, the leaves soaking, the base built, the specific smell of her mother's kitchen beginning to assert itself into the Sengbakgu air, when she heard the gate. She had not expected him. He said Osaka. He said Friday. She had not calculated for Sunday. She heard his voice in the courtyard, brief, low, speaking to someone on the phone, and then the screen door, and then the kitchen doorway where he stopped. He was wearing a coat she hadn't seen before, less structured than his usual ones, and he looked, she registered this before she had time to be tactful about it, like a man who had not slept on the flight back from wherever he had actually been. Not Osaka. She knew this before she knew it. Something in the tightness around his eyes was not tiredness from travel. It was the specific look of someone who had been carrying something heavy through several time zones and had not put it down. He looked at her. He looked at the counter, the leaves, the pot, the organized mise-en-place she had assembled. He looked at her again. "You came," he said. "I said the kitchen was free on weekend mornings." "I said that on Thursday. It's still the weekend." He came into the kitchen. He sat on the low stool near the window, not at the prep counter, not in her space, at a respectful distance that nevertheless put him close enough that she was aware of him, the way you are aware of weather. "I thought you were in Osaka," she said, carefully neutral. Something crossed his face. "I came back early. Is everything all right?" A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "No," he said, simply, "but it will be." She looked at him. He was looking at her pot with the unfocused gaze of someone seeing something else entirely. His hands were loose in his lap, the first time she had seen them without a phone or a pen or a document, just his hands, empty. She turned back to the stove. She stirred. The smell was building now, deep and green and complicated, the uziza asserting itself against the Korean air with the confidence of something that had been made for centuries and knew its own value. "What is that smell?" he asked, not unpleasantly, with the careful curiosity of someone encountering genuinely new. "My mother's kitchen," translated. He was quiet. Then, "Tell me what it is, the soup." So she told him, stirring as she spoke, the bitter leaf, the ofe onogbu, the way her mother made it with stockfish and goat meat, and the patience of someone who understood that the bitterness needed time to become the point rather than the problem. She was talking about the soup. She was also not talking about the soup. He listened with the complete attention she had identified as his, not nodding, not inserting himself, simply present and receiving. When she finished, there was a quiet that felt full rather than empty. "My mother made doenjang jjigae every Sunday," he said, quietly, unprompted. Without variation, same pot, same timing. She said the repetition was the point, that some things need to be made the same way every time so that you always know where they are. Adaeze looked at him. "She doesn't make it anymore?" "She passed away 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." "She would have—" He stopped. He looked at the pot. "She would have had opinions about the uziza leaves." It surprised a laugh out of her, small and genuine, and she saw him absorb it with something in his expression that was close to relief, like he had been waiting to hear that sound and hadn't known it yet. The soup finished at noon. She served it, 2 bowls, because there was enough and because it seemed wrong not to, because her mother had never made a pot of ofe onogbu for one person in her life, and some habits are deeper than intention. He looked at the bowl in front of him. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said, and he believed him. He tasted it carefully. His face did the thing that faces do when a flavor is genuinely new, the slight recalibration, the reassessment, the moment of deciding. Then something settled. He took another spoonful. "The bitterness," he said. "Yes. It becomes something else. That's the whole argument. You have to stay with it long enough to make the bitterness the point rather than the problem." He looked at her over the bowl. The autumn light through the kitchen window was gentle and specific, and it found the angles of his face with the particular honesty that midday light has. And what she saw there, in the unguarded one, the tired one, the real one, was a man who had been staying with bitterness for a long time and was not sure what it was becoming. She wanted to ask about Osaka. She wanted to ask about the call in the briefing room on Wednesday, the one that made his shoulders do that thing. She wanted to ask about his brother, because she had done what careful people do when they become interested in someone. She had read, and what she had read in a 2022 Korea Economic Daily profile included a paragraph about a younger brother, Kwon Seokhyun, formerly of KSH Group's Sustainability Division, written in the careful past tense that publications use when they do not know exactly what happened, but know something did. She asked none of these things. Not yet. There was a sequence to trust, and she respected sequences. They ate. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the persimmon tree held its remaining fruit against the October sky. He walked her to the gate again at 1 o'clock. The street was Sunday quiet. Somewhere nearby, someone was playing music, something she didn't recognize, Korean and melodic, drifting over the low walls. She turned at the gate. He was closer than he had been last Thursday, not by much, enough that she noticed. "The soup," he said. "Yes? Thank you for making it here." She looked at him. "Thank you for the kitchen." A pause. The music drifted. His eyes held hers with the focused quiet of someone who is deciding, again, whether to say the thing before he talks himself out of it. "Adaeze." "Yes?" "I should tell you something." His voice had shifted, not the chairman register, not the professional, careful English, something lower, closer to the real voice, the one under the one he used in rooms. "About why I came back early from—" His phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face did the thing, the old thing, the heavy obligation thing, and she understood immediately that whoever was calling was the same person who had called on Wednesday and made his shoulders tighten. "I have to go," she said. "It's fine." He answered the call. He turned slightly. She heard him say in Korean, very quietly, "I'm coming. I'll be there in 40 minutes. A pause, listening. Then, with a gentleness in his voice she had not heard before, directed at no one in the room they were sharing, I know. Don't do anything until I get there." He ended the call. He turned back to her. His face was a controlled surface over something that was not controlled at all. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "Go." He looked at her for one more second, the kind of second that contains a sentence, and then he walked down the street toward his waiting car and got in and was gone. Adaeze stood at the gate. She stood there for a long moment, the Sunday music still drifting, the aziza smell still faintly on her hands, the city moving around her in its enormous, patient way. Then she took out her phone. She opened the browser. She typed the name she had been carefully not typing for 11 days, Kwon Seokhyun. The results loaded. She read the first article, then the second, then the third, a small piece from a Korean mental health advocacy publication, 18 months old, that had clearly not been meant to reach the international press and had slipped through anyway. She read it twice. She stood on the street in Songbuk-gu on a Sunday in October with the phone in her hand and the Han River somewhere to the south and the persimmon tree behind the gate losing its fruit one by one, and she understood 3 things simultaneously. The first, the calls, the Osaka trip, the shoulders, the 3 a.m. insomnia, the tiredness that lived behind the precision, all of it had a single source. The second, he had been carrying this alone for 2 years in every boardroom and every window and every carefully composed silence, entirely alone. The third, the one that arrived last and landed deepest in the part of her that knew what it meant to survive something and spend the aftermath wondering if survival was the end of the story or the beginning of a different one. Kwon Seokhyun was not the man she had thought he was. He was something more specific than that, something more difficult, something that was going to require her to decide very soon how much of herself she was willing to bring to a situation she had not come to Seoul for. She put her phone in her pocket. She picked up her bag. She started walking. Behind her, through the gate, the last persimmon fell. She came to Seoul to disappear. She made her mother's soup in a stranger's kitchen instead. And now she knows his secret, the one that explains everything and changes everything and makes the next step either the bravest thing she has ever done or the one thing she came here specifically to avoid. Part 2 begins where this ends, with what she knows, with what he doesn't know she knows, with the Han River, patient and enormous, waiting to see what they will do with all of it. End of part 1.